Thank you for joining me today, Professor David Whyte of Queen Mary University of London and the Centre for Climate, Crime and Justice. Yesterday, Shell announced huge profits and that they intend to do lots of buybacks. What have you got to say about that?
Well, yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks, and thanks for asking such an important question, because that's a trend. It's been a kind of a growing trend that share buybacks and share dividends are at relatively high levels and have been for a number of years. So we've produced a report at the centre that you just mentioned. It came out I think about a month ago now, called Carbon Cash Machine. And the reason we called it that is because shareholders in BP and Shell, we calculated that since the Paris Agreement, the agreement was on paper in December 2015. It was finally ratified a couple of months later. But since December 2015, which is a good marker, because you can't the Paris Agreement was a very clear indication that we had to start divesting from fossil fuels. But shareholder earnings have tripled. Annual shareholder earnings have tripled since the Paris Agreement. Now that's very significant, because it's a real boom time now for shareholders in the big oil companies. We analysed BP and Shell, and when we say shareholder earnings, and we're combining dividends and share buybacks, that's basically the cash that shareholders directly benefit from. So when we get this news, it raises profound questions about where we go from here, because actually the fossil fuel industry, or big oil and gas, is not supposed to be as profitable at the moment. And we need to be thinking about how do we genuinely prompt trends towards divestment, moving away from fossil fuels and into renewables, in a context where the shareholders' benefits from fossil fuels are absolutely rocketing at the moment.
And the King's Speech, it's said that Rishi Sunak is going to do an anti-green King's Speech, and that relates to North Sea oil licenses and cars being allowed to drive inside big cities.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, the deal on North Sea oil licenses has already been done, and actually, if we trace back the origins of the decision in the latest round, I mean, they go right back to the COP26 conference, and people will remember that Alok Sharma was the president, who was the president, cabinet minister, was the president of COP26, was making noises about, actually said that it would be unacceptable at the moment to be opening up the North Sea. Now, I'm not sure if he knew that at the time, but certainly his cabinet colleagues knew it, and certainly Boris Johnson as Prime Minister knew that they were going to do precisely the opposite, because immediately COP26 had finished, they started making noises about issuing a fresh round of licenses. And this latest one, indeed, is the second round, and it includes the huge Rosebank field. Now, we cannot seriously claim to be leaders in divestment, or in the search for a transition, or in moves towards renewable fuels, whilst we are opening up the North Sea. That's the first thing. I mean, even if we go back to the couple of years ago when COP26 was happening, around that time, the International Energy Agency, hardly the most radical body, but the body that represents energy interests around the world, said that we have to leave oil and gas in the ground if we're going to get close to the Paris Agreement targets. So the British government is playing fast and loose with our future very clearly, and that's wholly unacceptable. They have to be questioned for that. They dress it up in a language of energy security, but we know that most of that oil and gas is going to be exported anyway. And if you speak to people who are working in the sector right now, they know that the days are numbered for the oil and gas industry. This is just prolonging the pain, in a sense. And what they want the government to do is to invest heavily in the infrastructure that can allow us to transition to renewable fuels, using exactly the same technology, using the same fabrication yards, and using the same equipment that has been used now for over 40 years in the North Sea. And so we have to ask big questions about why the government is not prompting a green industrial revolution, or even just an industrial strategy to get us away from a fossil fuel economy that's on its last legs, to be honest. So that's the North Sea. But Sunak is quite clearly, the Prime Minister is quite clearly trying to turn this into an identity issue, to argue that climate is a woke issue, a luxury issue that only the kind of tofu munchers in the rich parts of the country are concerned with. And I mean that's absolute nonsense as well, because our cities are overpolluted. We now have rising levels of asthma because of pollution. We count the people whose deaths are brought forward, that's the government term, from pollution in this country is up to 200,000 a year. So this is a serious problem. When you talk about ULEZ, the ultra low emission zones in cities like Manchester and Glasgow and London, these are crucial in terms of keeping people healthy. They're not a luxury or an add-on. Now, one of the things that we have to say about Sunak's political attack on the control of pollution is, and I'm going to quote him now, he says, well, I'm on the side of the taxi driver. Now, first of all, that's a myth, because most taxis most taxis in our cities are now operating either as electric vehicles, or they're going to be transitioning much faster than the rest of the economy. So the taxi sector is not the problem here. There is a problem for people who have to drive vehicles to their work and have to use vehicles, the so-called white van man. I hate that term. I'm using it as shorthand here. Now, these people should be compensated. These people are paying the price of the effects of a carbon economy that's not their fault. We should have embarked on this transition years ago. And so I think people should not be compensated in the trifling and tokenistic way that they are now. But if we are saying people, the people who depend on their vehicles for their livelihood have to change now, then we have to make sure that transition is paid for. And the way we do it is by taxing oil companies. The way we do it is go back to your earlier question and say, well, what of that 6 billion profit, how much of that could we tax to pay for cleaning up our cities and make sure that the white van, the people that rely on transport to work or rely on white van transportation, sorry to use that term again, are adequately compensated, and compensated by the people who are making our cities dirty, i.e. the BPs and Shells of this world. So I think we need to get real about this politics and not start turning it into a kind of trifling identity kind of wokeism, because it doesn't get us anywhere in actually moving towards a strong economy which is beyond a carbon-based economy, which we know, as I say, is on its last legs.
As it's assumed that Sunak is going to lose the election, that the Conservatives are going to lose the election, do you think maybe to some extent the more extreme they go out there, the more they'll force the next government to have to tag along with them in some sense? Because Rachel Reeves has already upset Ed Miliband apparently by you turning on some of her green pledges.
I mean, it could be the strategy. There's also something else at play. They're clearly playing to their own right wing, their own extreme, and let's call them the lunatic right, because there are climate skeptics within the Tory party. Some of them are on GB News quite regularly. So Sunak is also, he has to keep together a very fragmented party, and one of the ways he's doing that populism is appealing to the extreme right within his party, as well as trying to be like kind of blaming Labour for screwing over ordinary people who care more about their livelihoods than pollution. It's a false choice. It's a false opposition, and I think Labour have to wake up to that if they are going to be serious about being the party of government. They have to get over this false opposition between pollution and working people, because we have to remember as well that it's working people who live in the most polluted areas in the cities. I'm talking to you from East London. This is I'm in the most polluted area of London, where there are a number of campaigns. For example, young people in the East End founded a campaign called Choked Up, because they're fed up of being exposed to to high levels of pollution. So these are the problems that are affecting working people the most. And what Sunak's trying to do is he's trying to turn it into an issue that is actually against the interests of working people. But the only way to identify this as an issue for working people is to say, well, actually, yes, where then do we get the money to make sure that working people don't lose out? And that's why I think we have to be seriously talking about a more progressive taxation regime that taxes those who create the problems in the first place.
And I, just as you didn't like particularly the word white van, citizens are sometimes referred to as consumers. What, and obviously we're supposed to be voters as well. But what do you think, if you forget about the election itself, what other actions could people either in the way where they work, how they work, or how we consume? What kind of moves can be made? Because I know that that's something that you've organised a conference on recently.
Yeah, we organised a conference which looked at the role that trade unions can play in the transition, in a you know, how the trade unions can step up to the plate, if you like, and think about how they represent their workers here, and that's not just the big political questions about, you know, how we invest in industry and so on, which is really important, but it's also what we do right now in the workplace, because workers are in danger of being left behind. We know that a lot of the industries which transition from dirty industries to clean industries rely a lot on automated technologies. We also know that sectors like recycling and responsible waste disposal are areas where workers pay a price. They're very dangerous industries very often, so they pay a price in terms of industrial injuries. And we also know that some of the so-called green solutions are causing a number of other secondary problems of pollution and so on. So one of the things we need to think about is where power lies in the economy, and very often workers do have power to take action over these issues, but they're not given that power. The solutions are kind of handed down from above. And I'm going to give two examples of how I think workers have a role to play. It's very clear that our economy, in some sectors of our economy, things are intensifying. Workers are being asked to work longer hours for the same or even less pay. We're producing a huge number of things that we don't need. And so there is what some people have described as an overheating of the economy. And actually, probably because we have, you know, access to a range of new technologies, we don't need to be working as long hours, right? We don't need to be keeping on pushing up the profitability of employers. We might think about a sustainable economy as an economy where we reduce the working week, right? Or certainly where we have less people on temporary contracts. You cannot have a sustainable economy. You can't make key strategic decisions which implement resources in one part of the economy if you've got an economy based upon a precarious workforce which just follows where the quickest profit is. So there's a fundamental connection between stability in employment and a sustainable economy in the long term. So those are two things that it's in the interest of workers to take action on in the workplace through their trade unions, to demand a shorter working week, to demand less intense production cycles across what are increasingly long supply chains, and to demand security of employment. And we think there's a role for workers that has to be enhanced, and that's one thing the centre is committed to do. And we have to be on the side of working people, because it's working people that pay the biggest price of the climate crisis, and it's working people that are in many ways the solution to a problem that's been created by irresponsible employers. Let's put it that way.
If you look at the North Sea, for example, when I attended the conference on Friday, I remember hearing people who were representing workers up in the North Sea. And I remember hearing that there appeared to be, I didn't hear the numbers, but workers who work on wind and workers who work on oil and gas. How's that going? Because of course, with all these licenses being signed, are there things that the workers in oil and gas can do as part of their collective bargaining, as part of their health and safety, as part of their safety of the planet, for example? Will they get listened to? Are they able to talk about that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two. Let's take two parts of that question. The first part about the health and safety and about the way workers are being treated in the new kind of renewables, the switch towards renewables. I'm going to give you one example. There are some of the platforms that they're using to construct wind turbines are the same platforms that they were using to construct the oil infrastructure, the oil platforms, oil production platforms. In fact, a friend of mine recently phoned me up and told me about I had been working on one of those platforms. It was one of the platforms that was in the North Sea in the 1980s, building the oil infrastructure, now building the wind turbines, almost entirely crewed by Filipino workers on very, very low wages, undercrewed, understaffed. These are workers who are not in a trade union. And some of the other staff were UK workers, the people I was in touch with, who are cleaners and doing other kind of ancillary jobs. Safety conditions are horrendous. It's operated under a flag of convenience. I think the particular rig I'm talking about, the platform I'm talking about, is registered in Liberia. So you have the conditions where workers are there's a kind of ultra exploitation of workers, generally on low wages and very unsafe conditions. And that's not sustainable. That's not the switch towards it's not a just transition in any sense of the word, right? So these are big concerns that were being reflected in the discussions, and these issues are not going to go away until there is worker-led action, there's regulatory action, and to be honest, a wholesale revamp of that industry. And that brings us on to the second issue, because it was workers who are members of the RMT union who were talking about this at the conference. They're very, very angry that there has not been an industrial plan. There's not been anything like an industrial plan to take the fabrication capacity that exists in the northeast of Scotland, because it's been servicing and supplying and doing construction work for the North Sea industry for more than 40 years now. That infrastructure is not being exploited properly. There's been no plan, government plan, industrial plan, to make sure that every single job that's under threat in the North Sea now becomes a well-paid, skilled job in the transition. Much of the infrastructure has been imported from Denmark and Germany, so we're not even building the infrastructure, giving a lie to the whole idea that Brexit would stimulate British industry. So a whole series of problems which are about the infrastructure that offshore workers in the North Sea are really angry about right now. And I think that's an anger that we need to harness, and we need to be asking those questions of the Sunak government, of course, but whichever government comes after. Why has government just stood back and allowed workers to be exploited, and allowed actually this to develop in a very uncontrolled, fragmented, and quite frankly, inadequate way, in a way that is not going to secure the benefits for the economy, or for workers and their families, or for the community, or for us as the users of electricity supply. So a whole number of failures there that you get real insights into when you talk about the workers that work in those industries. And I think there were also members of the public sector union, the PCS, who were talking about the absolute chaos in government policy when it comes to just transition, about the ways in which no government department is talking to each other. There's different pots of funding flying around anywhere, huge amounts of waste. I mean, when public sector workers, when the civil servants and the local authority workers union is telling you that things are being run chaotically, then they know what they're talking about, and they themselves have a plan for how you develop a government infrastructure that is capable of dealing with the transition, and we're nowhere near that. So, I mean, I could go on, but there were other groups of workers in key sectors who were also talking about the role they need to play in this transition.
Who did you say had a plan of how to do the transition? Just now, you referred to some people who had a plan. Were you talking about?
Well, the PCS are talking about how you do it through government, and the RMT workers are just angry that there is no plan in the North Sea. That's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me as though part of the picture that you just painted was a lot of the contracts are going to foreign ownership, and for the oil, and that some of the wind, it sounds like that's almost like gig economy. In terms of the workers and the lack of safety, which obviously is something that many of us know about just from, just walking down the street.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Have you got any more reports coming out very soon or anything like that?
Our next report is going to be looking at how international law can deal with the problem of ecocide, which is a hotly disputed discussion. We're also in the next spring, we're hoping to be releasing some work. Next spring and summer, we're hoping to be releasing some work which looks at the regulation of sewage and the water companies and the scandal that's kind of beset our water quality in our rivers and seas in the last few years. We want to look at actually, the wider issues of environmental regulation. So it's not just about the sewage in our seas and in our rivers, but there's a real crisis in environmental regulation that needs to be uncovered. So we'll be doing some work on that as well, and we'll come back to looking at the profits of the big oil companies, because there are this trend that I referred to at the start, where you've got this tripling of shareholder earnings is not declining. If anything, it's going to increase. So we're going to be keeping an eye on that.
Thanks very much for joining us, Professor David Whyte of the Queen Mary University of London Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.